The morning mist clung to the valley like a funeral shroud. It was April 17th, 1945, somewhere on the southern end of Okinawa, in the broken country between the American lines and the outer defenses of the Shuri Line. A company of the 382nd Infantry Regiment lay pinned in a shallow depression. They had been there for 11 hours. 3 men had tried to move. 3 men were dead. The Japanese snipers had found their range. Private First Class Raymond Ray Taggart pressed his face into the mud and listened to the crack of another Arisaka round, splitting the air above him. The bullet struck coral somewhere behind him, sending fragments rattling across helmets. Nobody moved. Nobody had moved in hours. Taggart was 23 years old, a former ranch hand from Uvalde, Texas, where the land ran flat and open, and a man could see trouble coming from miles away. He had spent his childhood tracking deer through mesquite brush, learning patience from his grandfather, a man who could sit motionless for 6 hours waiting for a single clean shot. Those skills had gotten him assigned as lead scout for Company K. They had also gotten him into this mess. Taggart, the voice was barely a whisper. Lieutenant Morrison, 15 feet to his left, face down in the same mud. "We can't stay here." Taggart didn't answer. He was watching. Watching a slight movement in the tree line 400 yards south. Watching the way the morning light caught something metallic on the ridge to the east. Watching the pattern of the shots. Not random, not desperate, but methodical, patient. The Japanese had them zeroed. The depression they occupied was perhaps 40 yards wide and 20 yards deep. A natural bowl carved by ancient water runoff. It had seemed like good cover during the night approach. Now it was a killing ground. The Japanese had let them walk right into it, had waited until the entire company was committed, and then had opened fire from 3 directions. Captain Hendricks had been the first to die, a bullet through his throat before he could give a single order. Sergeant Walsh had tried to organize a retreat and caught 2 rounds in the chest. The company medic, a kid from Ohio named Brennan, had been hit trying to reach Walsh. 87 men had entered the depression. 84 remained, and none of them could move. "We need artillery," Morrison whispered. "We need to call in a strike." "Radio's dead, sir." Henderson took a round through the pack. "Then we need a runner." Taggart had been waiting for that. He had known, from the moment the first shot cracked, that it would come to this. "Sir," he said, keeping his voice low, "they've got 3 positions, maybe 4. Every approach is covered. A runner breaks cover. He's dead before he makes 10 yards. "Then what do you suggest, Private?" Taggart didn't answer immediately. He was calculating distances, angles, sight lines. The Japanese positions were well chosen. They had overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, excellent concealment. Whoever had set this ambush knew exactly what they were doing. But they had made one mistake. They were watching the approaches, the paths a man would take if he was running, the ground a man would cover if he was trying to escape. They weren't watching the ground a man would cover if he was willing to crawl for a mile. "There's a drainage cut," Taggart said. "Runs northeast from our position. It's shallow, maybe 8 inches deep at most, filled with mud and water. I know the cut. It's exposed for the first 100 yards. "Not exposed, sir. Just open. There's a difference." Taggart paused. "The snipers are watching the tree line, the ridges, the high ground. They're not watching 8 inches of mud." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That cut runs for over a mile before it reaches our lines." "Yes, sir." "You're talking about crawling a mile, on your belly, through mud and water, with Japanese snipers watching every inch of ground." "Yes, sir." "That's suicide." "No, sir. Running is suicide. Crawling is just slow." The lieutenant didn't respond. Taggart could hear him breathing, could hear the calculation in that silence. 84 men, 11 hours, 3 dead already, and more would follow if they stayed here until nightfall, and there was no guarantee the Japanese wouldn't assault their position once darkness fell. "How long?" Morrison finally asked. 4 hours, maybe 5, depends on the ground." "We don't have 5 hours." "We don't have any other options, sir." Another long silence. Another crack of a rifle somewhere in the trees. Another man crying out. Corporal Davis, hit in the shoulder, the sound of his pain muffled by the mud he was pressing his face into. "Go," Morrison said. "God help you." Taggart began to move. The first 100 yards were the worst. The drainage cut was barely a depression in the ground, a slight fold in the earth where rainwater had carved a channel over decades of monsoon seasons. In the dry months, it would have been invisible. Now, in the wet season, it held perhaps 3 inches of brown water and 5 inches of sucking mud. Taggart pressed himself flat, not low, flat, his chin in the water, his arms stretched ahead of him, his fingers digging into the mud for purchase. He moved like a snake, no, slower than a snake. He moved like mud itself, like something that didn't move at all, just gradually changed position. An inch, 2 inches, a foot, the crack of a rifle, the whine of a bullet, but not close. The snipers were firing at something else, someone else. One of the men in the depression who had shifted too quickly, breathed too deeply. Taggart forced himself not to flinch. Flinching was movement. Movement was death. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the ground immediately ahead. The cut curved slightly to the left here, which was good. It took him out of the direct sight line of the eastern ridge, but it also brought him closer to the tree line to the south, where at least 2 snipers were positioned. He could hear them now, not the shots. The sounds between the shots, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the small human sounds of men who had been in position for hours, waiting for their targets to make mistakes. Taggart had hunted deer with his grandfather in country like this. He knew the patience of the predator, the absolute stillness required to become invisible. He knew that movement caught the eye before shape or color, that the human brain was wired to detect motion against a static background. So he became static. He became part of the landscape. Inch by inch, foot by foot. The first 100 yards took 45 minutes. His muscles screamed for him to move faster. Every instinct in his body told him to get up, to run, to escape this killing ground while he still had the chance. But Taggart had learned to ignore his instincts. He had learned that the body's desire for speed was often the body's path to death. He thought about his grandfather's voice. Calm, measured, patient. The deer doesn't see you because you're hidden, Raymond. The deer doesn't see you because you're slow. If you move like the grass, the deer thinks you're grass. If you move like the wind, the deer thinks you're wind. If you move like nothing at all, the deer doesn't think about you at all. Taggart moved like nothing at all. By the time he reached the bend in the cut, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning mist. This was both good and bad. Good because the mist had been providing the snipers with diffused light, the kind that made movement easier to spot. Bad because now the mud was beginning to steam, and Taggart's body heat was creating a faint vapor trail wherever he crawled. He stopped, pressed himself deeper into the water, let his body temperature equalize with the mud around him. The water was cold, not freezing, but cold enough to leach the heat from his body, to make his muscles stiff and unresponsive. He would pay for this later, he knew. His joints would ache, his muscles would cramp, his body would remember this cold for days. But later was a luxury he couldn't afford to think about. Later meant survival. Later meant the future. Right now, there was only the mud and the snipers, and the inch-by-inch progress toward salvation. Patience. That was the key. His grandfather had taught him that the deer always won if you let them dictate the pace. The hunter won by refusing to play the deer's game. The Japanese snipers were the hunters here, but Taggart was refusing to be prey. After 10 minutes, he began moving again. The cut deepened slightly here, offering perhaps 10 inches of cover. Still not enough to move quickly, but enough to reduce the pucker factor slightly. Taggart allowed himself to breathe a little easier. That was when he saw the boot. It was 30 yards ahead, on the edge of the cut, a Japanese split-toe tabby boot, attached to a leg that disappeared into the undergrowth. Taggart froze. For a full 5 minutes, he didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. The leg didn't move either. Dead, sleeping, waiting. Taggart studied what he could see. The boot was weathered, mud-caked. The leg was bent at an unnatural angle. And there, yes, there was the dark stain of dried blood on the fabric above the boot. Dead. Had to be. Probably a casualty from an earlier engagement, left where he fell. The fighting on Okinawa had been brutal. Japanese soldiers died in their positions, and neither side had time to bury the fallen properly. But Taggart waited another 5 minutes anyway. Then, another 5. Then, satisfied that the corpse was truly a corpse, He began to move again. He gave the body a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of caution. Dead men sometimes carried surprises, grenades with loosened pins, booby traps rigged to explode when the body was moved. The Japanese were masters of turning their own casualties into weapons. This one didn't, but Taggart didn't touch it anyway. He crawled past, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead, his mind already calculating the next 100 yards. Behind him, the dead Japanese soldier stared at the sky with empty eyes. Ahead, the living Japanese snipers waited with loaded rifles. Between them, one American crawled through the mud. The middle section of the cut was the easiest part of the journey. The terrain here was broken by shell craters and collapsed earthworks, debris from the naval bombardment that had preceded the American landing. The cut wound through this devastation like a thread through torn fabric, offering more cover than Taggart had dared hope for. He moved faster here, not fast, never fast, but faster. 2 inches at a time instead of 1, perhaps 100 yards per hour instead of 50. The land around him was a wasteland, trees shattered to splinters, coral formations blown apart, the earth itself torn and churned by the violence of modern war. In another context, he might have felt horror at the destruction. Here, he felt only gratitude. Every crater was cover, every fallen tree was concealment. But even here, he could feel the Japanese watching. Not see them, never see them. The good snipers, and these were good, never let themselves be seen. They chose their positions for concealment as much as for field of fire, and they moved only when necessary, and they waited with the patience of stones. Taggart knew this because he would have done the same thing. The Japanese sniper doctrine was different from the American approach. American snipers were trained to take shots and move, to use mobility as protection. Japanese snipers were trained to find the perfect position and hold it, sometimes for days, waiting for the perfect shot. He had heard the stories from other scouts, Japanese snipers who had remained in their positions for 72 hours without food or water. Japanese snipers who had shot a dozen Americans from a single tree before anyone could locate them. Japanese snipers who had died rather than abandon their posts, their bodies found with fingers still curled around triggers. These snipers had found their perfect positions. The American company in that depression was their perfect target, and they would wait for hours, for days if necessary, until every single American was dead or captured, unless someone broke the stalemate, unless someone crawled a mile through mud and water and called in the artillery that would blast those perfect positions into memory. Taggart kept crawling. The mud sucked at him with every movement. His uniform was soaked through, heavy with water and earth. His rifle, slung across his back, dug into his spine with every inch of progress. His hands were raw from gripping the ground, his elbows torn by coral fragments hidden beneath the water. He didn't think about the pain. Pain was a message from the body, and right now his body's messages were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the next inch, the next foot, the next 100 yards. Somewhere behind him, 84 men waited to live or die based on his success. Somewhere ahead, the American lines waited with the artillery that could end this nightmare. Somewhere around him, Japanese snipers waited for him to make a single mistake. Taggart didn't make mistakes. He just crawled. 3 hours in, he reached the stream. The cut ended here, joining a shallow creek that ran northeast toward the American lines. The creek was perhaps 2 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with steep banks that offered excellent concealment. It was also directly overlooked by the Japanese position on the eastern ridge. Taggart lay in the mud at the junction of cut and creek, studying the terrain. The ridge was perhaps 300 yards away, a broken coral formation that rose perhaps 50 feet above the surrounding ground. Somewhere in that coral, at least one sniper was watching. He could see the position now, or rather, he could see where the position had to be. A dark shadow among the rocks, a slight irregularity in the natural formations, the kind of thing that a trained scout learned to recognize, the difference between natural terrain and human concealment. The sniper was there, watching, waiting, and the creek ran directly beneath his line of fire. Taggart considered his options. The creek was the fastest route to the American lines. It was deep enough to provide real cover, wide enough to move without restriction. He could be at the American positions in 30 minutes if he took the creek. But 30 minutes was a long time when a sniper was watching. The Japanese soldier on that ridge had the patience to wait. He had the skill to make the shot, and he had the angle. The creek ran almost directly toward his position for the first 200 yards before curving away. 200 yards of exposure, 200 yards of target. Taggart could try to time his movement, wait for the sniper to look away, to blink, to lose focus for just a moment. But he knew better. The sniper wouldn't look away. The sniper had been waiting for hours, maybe days, for exactly this opportunity. There was another option. Taggart had noticed it during his long crawl, a faint depression running parallel to the creek, perhaps 20 yards to the west. It was even shallower than the original cut, barely 6 inches of cover, but it was on the blind side of the ridge, screened from the sniper's view by a slight fold in the ground. It would add another quarter-mile to his journey. It would take at least another hour. The ground was rougher there, the mud deeper, the progress slower, but it would keep him alive. Taggart made his decision. He began to move. The parallel depression was worse than the drainage cut. Here, the water was stagnant and foul-smelling, covered with a thin film of algae that coated Taggart's face with every inch of progress. Insects swarmed in clouds above the surface, drawn by the heat of his body. Something slithered through the mud beside him, a snake or an eel or something worse. He didn't look to see. He kept his eyes forward. He kept his movements slow. He kept crawling. The ground here was treacherous. Hidden rocks lurked beneath the mud, ready to scrape exposed skin or catch on equipment. Tree roots crossed the depression like tripwires, forcing him to navigate around them or beneath them with agonizing care. Every few minutes, he stopped to listen. The sounds of the Japanese positions were fainter here, muffled by distance and terrain, but he could still hear them, the occasional crack of a rifle, the distant shout of Japanese voices, the rhythm of an enemy who was patient but not passive. They were still hunting, still watching, still waiting, but they weren't watching this depression. They weren't waiting for a man who moved like mud through mud. Taggart kept crawling. His body was failing now. 4 hours of sustained crawling had pushed him past the limits of normal endurance. His arms trembled with every movement. His legs cramped every few minutes, forcing him to pause and wait for the spasms to pass. His vision blurred from the strain and the exhaustion. But his mind was clear. His mind was calm. His mind was focused on one thing and one thing only. The next inch. An inch, then another, then another. The American lines were close now. He could hear them clearly. The sound of American voices, the rumble of vehicles, the mechanical rhythm of an army at war. Close enough to touch, almost. Close enough to make a man forget his patience and start running. Taggart didn't run. He didn't hurry. He didn't change his pace by a single inch per minute. The last mile was the hardest, not because of the terrain. The ground here was actually easier, the mud less deep, the cover more consistent, but because Taggart could hear the sounds of his own lines now. American voices, the rumble of tanks, the distant thump of artillery. Safety. So close he could almost taste it. That was when men made mistakes. That was when the patience broke, when the discipline crumbled, when the overwhelming urge to just get up and run overcame every rational thought. Taggart had seen it happen. On Leyte, a man from his platoon had survived an entire night in a Japanese-controlled village, hiding in a pigsty, covered in filth, not moving for 12 hours. And then, with the American lines in sight, he had broken cover and started running. The Japanese machine gun had cut him nearly in half. Taggart did not run. He did not hurry. He did not change his pace by a single inch per minute. 4 hours and 23 minutes after leaving the depression, he crawled into an American foxhole. The 2 soldiers inside nearly shot him. He was so covered in mud, so slow-moving, so utterly unlike anything they expected that they didn't recognize him as human until he spoke. "I need a radio," Taggart said. "Now." The artillery strike began 18 minutes later. Taggart had described the Japanese positions with the precision of a surveyor. Distances, angles, concealment, likely fields of fire. He had crawled past those positions. He had studied them for hours. He knew them better than the Japanese did themselves. The forward observer had translated his observations into coordinates. The Fire Direction Center had computed the solutions, and the 155mm howitzers of the division artillery had done the rest. The first rounds landed on the tree line to the south. Taggart heard the distant whistle of the shells, then the crash of the explosions, then the secondary sounds, trees splintering, ammunition cooking off, the screams of men caught in the blast. The second salvo hit the eastern ridge. The coral formation that had sheltered the sniper disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. More explosions, more screams, more death. The third salvo walked across both positions systematically, the shells bursting in perfectly timed sequence. This was the American way of war. Overwhelming firepower, precisely applied. The Japanese snipers, who had waited so patiently in their perfect positions, were dying now. Killed by shells they never saw coming, called in by a man they never saw at all. From his position behind the American lines, Taggart watched the explosions through borrowed binoculars. He saw the trees shatter. He saw the coral spray. He saw the ammunition cook off in secondary explosions that sent pillars of fire into the morning sky. And then, after perhaps 10 minutes of sustained bombardment, he saw the survivors of Company K begin to move. They came out of the depression slowly, carefully, weapons ready. They were mud-covered and exhausted, some of them wounded, all of them shaken, but they were alive. 81 men emerged from that killing ground. 3 had died in the 11 hours of waiting, but 81 had survived, because one man had been willing to crawl a mile. Lieutenant Morrison found Taggart 3 hours later. The private was sitting against a supply crate, drinking coffee from a canteen cup, and staring at nothing. He was still covered in mud. He hadn't moved since calling in the artillery strike. Taggart. The private looked up. His eyes were distant, unfocused, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had pushed himself past every normal limit. Sir. Morrison sat down next to him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Around them, the sounds of war continued. Artillery in the distance, aircraft overhead, the constant movement of men and machines. 4 hours, Morrison finally said. You crawled for 4 hours, through mud and water, with snipers watching every inch of ground. 4 hours and 23 minutes, sir. The men are calling you the Snake. Did you know that? Taggart shook his head slightly. I'm not a snake, sir. Snakes move too fast. Morrison almost laughed. Almost. How did you do it? How did you keep moving when you knew they were watching? Taggart was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. My grandfather taught me to hunt deer when I was 8 years old. First lesson he ever gave me. The deer sees motion. The deer doesn't see patience. Same thing works both ways, sir. A sniper is just a deer with a rifle. He sees what moves. He doesn't see what waits. You waited for 4 hours, while crawling. I moved slow enough that I wasn't moving, sir. I was just gradually somewhere else. Morrison shook his head. I've been in this war for 2 years. I've seen a lot of brave men. I've never seen anything like what you did today. Taggart finished his coffee, set the cup down. When he looked at Morrison, his eyes had come back into focus. It wasn't brave, sir. Brave is standing up when you should stay down. Brave is charging a machine gun nest. What I did wasn't brave. He paused. What I did was patient. There's a difference. Is there? Taggart thought about the question. Thought about the 4 hours in the mud. Thought about the 81 men who were alive because he had refused to hurry. Yes, sir. Bravery is doing something despite being afraid. Patience is doing something despite being tempted. Different kind of discipline. Morrison nodded slowly. I'm recommending you for a decoration. Silver Star, at least. I don't need a decoration, sir. No, but the men who made it out need to know that what you did mattered, that it's being recognized. Morrison stood. Get some rest, Private. You've earned it. Taggart watched him go. Then he leaned back against the supply crate and closed his eyes. In his mind, he was still crawling, still moving inch by inch through the mud, still refusing to hurry. He wondered if he would ever stop. The story of Raymond Taggart's crawl spread through the 96th Division within days. Some men didn't believe it. 4 hours through mud and water with Japanese snipers watching every inch of ground? Impossible. Had to be exaggerated, had to be embellished. But the 81 survivors of Company K believed it. They had watched him disappear into that drainage cut, had counted the minutes and then the hours, had given up hope, and then had heard the artillery begin to fall. They knew. The army recognized Taggart's actions with the Silver Star, awarded in a brief ceremony 3 weeks later. The citation mentioned extraordinary patience and tactical acumen, and complete disregard for personal safety. It didn't mention the mud, the cold, the 4 hours of sustained terror that he had controlled through sheer force of will. Citations never mentioned things like that. Taggart continued to serve as lead scout for Company K through the rest of the Okinawa campaign. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a mortar round near Sugarloaf Hill, once by a rifle round that passed through his left arm during the final push toward Shuri. Both times he returned to duty within weeks. The men of Company K treated him differently after the crawl. Not with awe exactly, soldiers don't do awe, but with a quiet respect that went beyond rank or experience. They knew what he had done. They knew what it had cost, and they knew that any of them might owe their lives to his patience someday. Some of them did. On June 3rd, Taggart led a patrol through Japanese-held territory to locate an enemy artillery position. The patrol was spotted, pinned down, cut off, and Taggart did exactly what he had done before, found a path that no one was watching, and crawled, inch by inch, back to the American lines to call in support. That time it only took 2 hours, but the principle was the same. When the war ended, Taggart went home to Uvalde. He never talked much about the crawl. When people asked, and people always asked once they heard the story, he would shrug and change the subject. What was there to say? He had done what needed to be done. Other men had done more and received less, but his grandfather understood. The old man was 91 when Raymond came home, weathered and bent, but still sharp-eyed. He listened to his grandson's abbreviated account of the crawl, nodding slowly, his face unreadable. 4 hours, he said, when Raymond finished. 4 hours and 23 minutes. Through mud and water. Yes, sir. With men trying to kill you. Yes, sir. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a rare expression on that weathered face, worn thin by decades of sun and wind and hard living. I taught you about deer, he said. Never figured you'd use it on men. Same principles, Grandpa. They see motion. They don't see patience. No. The old man shook his head. They see motion. They don't see faith. You had faith you'd make it. That's what kept you moving. Raymond thought about that for a long time. 4 hours in the mud. 4 hours of inching forward, of forcing himself not to hurry, of trusting that his patience would outlast their vigilance. Maybe the old man was right. Maybe it had been faith all along. Raymond Taggart married a local girl named Mary Ellen Vasquez in 1947. They had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, and ran the family ranch together until Raymond's father died and left them the whole operation. He never went back to war. When Korea came, he was too old for combat. When Vietnam came, his sons were too young. He watched both wars from the safety of his living room, grateful for his distance from the fighting. But he never forgot what he had learned. He taught his children to hunt the way his grandfather had taught him. Patience, stillness, the discipline of the long wait. And when they grew impatient, when they wanted to rush, when they wanted to take the shot before the shot was ready, he would tell them the same thing his grandfather had told him. The deer sees motion. The deer doesn't see patience. They learned. They all learned. And they taught their children, and their children taught theirs. And the lesson passed down through generations like a whispered secret. Raymond Taggart lived until 1994. He died at 72 on his ranch in Uvalde, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He had never left Texas after the war, had never wanted to see another ocean, another island, another patch of ground that reminded him of Okinawa. But he had taught his grandchildren well. He had taught them the same lessons his grandfather had taught him. Patience, stillness, the discipline of the long wait. And sometimes, when they grew frustrated with the hours of sitting motionless, he would tell them a story. Not the whole story, never the whole story, just enough to make them understand. I once crawled a mile, he would say. Took me 4 hours, and every inch of the way, I had to remind myself, they see motion, they don't see patience. The grandchildren would nod solemnly, not really understanding, but sensing that something important was being transmitted. And then Raymond would smile and say, "Now, let's see if you can wait another hour." They always could. He had taught them well. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, you can find a small exhibit dedicated to the scouts and snipers of the Okinawa campaign. There is no mention of Raymond Taggart by name. His action was one of thousands of small heroisms that collectively won the war. But there is a photograph of Company K, 382 Infantry Regiment, taken shortly after the battle described in this story. In the photograph, 81 men stand in rough formation, mud-caked and exhausted but alive. In the front row, third from the left, a young man stares at the camera with eyes that have seen something most men never see. He is not smiling. None of them are. But they are alive, all 81 of them, because one man was willing to crawl a mile, because one man understood something that the Japanese snipers, for all their skill and patience, never did, that there is a level of patience beyond patience, a stillness beyond stillness, a determination that cannot be measured in hours or yards or inches. The Japanese snipers had waited for his move. They had watched every inch of ground. They had been ready to kill anything that broke cover. But they never saw him. They never fired a single shot in his direction. They never knew, until the artillery began to fall, that one American had crawled through their killing ground and called down destruction on their heads. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is refuse to run. Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is move slowly enough to be invisible. And sometimes, just sometimes, the thing that ends a battle is not a charge or an assault or a brilliant tactical maneuver. Sometimes it's just a man in the mud, crawling towards salvation, 1 inch at a time. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories of individual courage deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Taggart's position? Could you have maintained that patience for 4 hours? And if you haven't already, check out our previous video on the Battle of Kakuzu Ridge. The larger context for this incredible story of one man's determination to save his company. Until next time.